Hey folks, Corey here, and welcome to another In Case You Missed It episode of Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. If you're new to the show, thanks to Podbean or Overcast or somebody cool just referred you to the program, we are so glad you found us. This week, we're sharing a handful of conversations that really reflect what TP&R is all about. Curiosity, courage, the kind of moral imagination we desperately need right now, and hopefully we're having a little bit of fun. Today's episode features Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington. Many of you will remember her brave and clarifying leadership in some of the most turbulent public moments of the last few years. I especially appreciated this visit with Bishop Budde. There was something about her demeanor that made me feel like we were old friends. It was really endearing. And the conversation we had earlier this year reflects all that. It goes deep into faith and character, public witness, and what it means to show up with love and integrity when the stakes are high. Quick thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible, and to our friends at the Village Square and Mesa Wealth Management for their partnership in building healthier civic culture. All right, here's my conversation with Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. I am so grateful to be able to continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde. Mariann Edgar Budde is the bishop and spiritual leader of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. and the Washington National Cathedral. Prior to her election in 2011, she was parish priest in Minneapolis for 18 years. You might recognize Bishop Budde from appearances she's made on PBS NewsHour, Meet the Press, Good Morning America, and The Today Show, among others, as well as for some headlines that have been written about a sermon that she delivered recently. I don't know. There might have been something. Bishop Budde, it is an honor to be with you today. Thank you for taking the time. How you holding up?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. I was really honored to be considered to spend some time with you. You know, I figured a great way to start. I have to give a hat tip to a dear friend of mine named Lisa Sharon Harper, who runs an organization called Freedom Road and has a podcast where, as she describes it, the podcast is she introduces it by saying the march from Selma to Montgomery is still going on. We're on that march, and these are the conversations we're having along the way. And Miss Lisa, the way she starts a lot of her conversations is simply by asking folks about their faith journey. I was so fascinated to hear the twists and turns along the way and how you came to the Lord and all that good stuff. Would you mind sharing some of that with us?
I'd be happy to. As you've indicated, it wasn't a linear journey, nor was it a one without a lot of influences from disparate places. My parents divorced early in my life, and so my upbringing was divided between my mother's household and my dad's. My mom was a spiritual person and religious in her practice, and she was also busy, traumatized by being a single parent at an early age with two young girls, and she stumbled into an Episcopal church that welcomed divorcees, which was somewhat of a scandal in the 1960s. So I had a sort of a very brief childhood experience in an Episcopal church that I don't really remember, because then I moved to live with my dad, and he was had been wounded by religion and he wanted nothing to do with anything that smelled of it. So I wandered around a bit in my own adolescence. And then a friend of mine invited me to church with her. And in that church, there was an altar call. And I had never experienced that before, never heard of it before. But the minister said something to the effect of, if you would like to invite Jesus into your heart, you're invited to come forward. And I had no idea what that meant. But as soon as he said that, I felt this ache in my heart. And I made my way to the altar and he prayed for me. I don't remember what he said. No huge flashing light, no big sudden transformation, but something happened, and something in my own desire to be part of uh, something, something about the love with which he prayed, something about feeling the love of God. And so from that moment on, I would say I considered myself um, a saved Christian, because that was the language that the people around me used, although they seemed much more excited about it than I felt. you know, and I often wondered if the experience took, like, did it, because when I'd hear this, I'd go to church with them again and I'd hear the altar call again, and I'd wonder if I should go back because I wasn't sure that enough had happened to me. Like the transformation wasn't complete, and but that was not allowed. I mean, you certainly didn't do that. You only went up once. And so I kind of lived with that tension about it, and but found myself in that community, and did my best to follow its teachings. They were very kind to me. Um, and I had other experiences in similar churches throughout my adolescence. But then I began to have questions. I mean, just things didn't make sense to me about that particular worldview. The path was very narrow. And only the people of that church were on it, right? Like, so we were the saved ones, and everyone else, even if they thought they were Christian, were not. And that made no sense to me. I didn't argue with anyone. I wasn't in an arguing place in my life, but I just lived with that tension. And for a time, because of circumstances in my family, I actually lived with the minister and his wife and children, and I watched their way they lived their lives. And I mean, they were perfectly fine people, but they were people, right? And their persona in church and their way they lived their lives in their home, it was a real difference. And again, I didn't question it. I mean, I questioned it, but I didn't challenge it. But then, because of, again, a change of family circumstances, I knew that I needed to go back and live with my mom. It's a long story I won't go into. And my mother was still very much active in her Episcopal church. And the minister of the church in Colorado, which is where I was living, was quite worried about me, that I would backslide if I attended my mom's Episcopal church. And I knew that was just like, again, I didn't argue, got on a plane, moved back to New Jersey, started attending that church. Um, and the minister of that church welcomed me and all of my questions, just all
Mm,
of my questions. And so I found a home where I could both honor the complexity of faith, of living a life of faith. And I was 17. And also there was this experience of coming to the communion rail every Sunday, which felt a little bit like an altar call, but like we all went up every week to receive the sacrament of the living presence of Christ. And so I found a spiritual home that allowed me to be both, grounded in my relationship with Christ and to grow in it, but also to allow a lot of questioning and acceptance of other faith traditions. And so as I went on from there, from college, I became very involved in the Roman Catholic Church in college, in part because that was the church that was most available to me. I was very inspired by the Central American Christians who were giving their lives during the Central American Wars. This was the 1980s. I became committed to a life of social justice when I was in my 20s. I traveled around the religious landscape, and I kept on coming back to the Episcopal Church. It was almost, I used to liken it like to middle C on the piano. It
mm,
became my home. Not a perfect church, not the best church, but it was my home. And and it was a joy beyond my ability to describe when I was accepted for ordination, again, very young, in my mid 20s. And I've been an ordained minister ever since. And
right.
not without, obviously, crises of faith along the way, but I feel like, God has been very gracious to me, and the light of Christ is the beacon of my life. Um, and all the questions and all the complexities of human life and the mysteries of the world, I, I bring to my relationship with him. and try to live as best I can in my. I love that line from the Apostle Paul where he talks about being an earthen vessel in which the light of, unless the treasure of Christ, we house it in this earthen vessel, so it's clear that the power doesn't come from us, but belongs to Him. So, long
there was,
story.
yeah, no, not at all. I'm going to make it longer actually, because there were aspects of it that I did take note of when you shared that in the book. How we learn to be brave. I think it's the third of your 3 books that came out a couple of
Yep.
years ago.
Yep.
The way you put it, and I think you just reiterated that here. You said, I was relieved to be released from a version of Christianity that I had secretly questioned more each day. And so it sounds, as you put it here, like that version, maybe you couldn't necessarily articulate it then as I guess a 17-year-old, but it was the exclusivity of that. Whereas I noticed in my own, because there are some similarities in my own faith journey, where when I became a Christian, our first church that we belonged to for about a decade and a half is called Grace Baptist Church. It's in John MacArthur's Valley, where the Masters University. So you don't really ask questions except to get a very, kind of concrete answer. This is what we believe, Whereas when I was introduced to the work of, in particular, N.T. Wright, I loved, especially his big books, I loved how he entered into an inquiry with the possibility that his faith may be shaken if he arrives at certain answers. So I'm wondering if that was the same dichotomy, that you were drawn more to an openness of the questions, as opposed to the rigidity of this is what we believe.
That's certainly one way to say it. But I also want to emphasize that the people who first introduced me to Christ and the first church that I was a part of, the uh, the people there loved me, and I loved them back. Right? I am so grateful for the experiences that I had with them, and so I didn't really want to argue with the minister. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
maybe I wasn't. I wasn't interested in winning an argument or of proving them wrong. I just felt like I couldn't fit as you said, I couldn't fit into that worldview. And there were so many other people that I cared about, including my mother, that didn't belong. And I just couldn't, I couldn't, I couldn't stay in a tradition where so many people were not welcomed. And one thing that the priest said to me, that my mentor priest when I was a teenager, he said, Mariann, if you think of something that is not loving and you say to yourself, well, I would never do that. He said, you can rest assured that God would never do that. That God, who is infinitely more loving than any of us could be. And our former presiding bishop, Michael Curry, used to say something similar. If it's not about love, it's not about God. That God is the source of all life and love, light, truth, all that is good. And that now, are there certain convictions or beliefs that I have as a Christian that others don't have? Yes, of course. And I hold them. And I am confident that the heart of God is big enough to hold it all. And the way that the creation is just looking around at creation, not only humankind, but all the species of the planet, it's pretty clear that the Creator loves diversity and loves the interplay of diverse beings. And so I leave that in God's hands. I'm just not going to try and figure that out. But nor am I equipped, really, emotionally or even intellectually, to argue it with people who feel otherwise, right? If they feel that way, there's nothing I can say other than my life experience that would say, I'm right and you're wrong. But I am confident, increasingly confident, that this is a place where I can, as a Christian, where I can stand, even if other Christians don't think I'm Christian in this position.
Right.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
It does. It does. So I guess there is a difference there. Having been born into a very observant Jewish family, if we're not arguing, we're rendered mute. You know, so so
And I love that about Judaism. I absolutely love that. And my Jewish friends are great at that kind of banter, right?
Yeah,
And
a lot
you
of
hear
folks.
it and you hear it in the scriptures too, this kind of back and forth with God. It's
Yeah, I was just
great.
going to point out Matthew 23. A lot of folks look at that as this big argument. Oh, it's terrible. I just look at it as Tuesday over kasha conditions, But I do hear something that you've said a couple times now, um, alluded to, and one way you put it is the love with which he prayed. Your pastor in Colorado,
Hmm.
and there's a certain grace that I've heard come from you in a few, even recently in an interview where you talked about the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue,
Hmm.
um, with a certain grace. Now, is that something that is a gift of yours that you were sort of born with this disposition, or is it a practice that's cultivated over time?
Well, definitely the latter. Um, and it's a discipline, right? It's a discipline and a practice that transcends how I might feel on a given day. I'm not a saint by any measure. I have my own full range of emotions, but to consciously choose uh, to be to offer the kind of grace that has been extended to me, and I think that's the key. If you have experienced unmerited grace, if you've experienced mercy, forgiveness when you didn't deserve it, when you've known yourself to be accepted as you are, there is the capacity to offer something of the same to another it grows in you. And I feel that for me, that's the life of faith. Um, do I have my times of intolerance and frustration and anger with people? Of course I do. And yet I try not to lead with that or to speak with that in any consistent way. Um, and when I hurt people, which I do, I try my best to make amends. Um, Now, sometimes people get hurt by what I say or do, and they might demand that I apologize for them. But I actually don't think I, if I can, if I don't believe I have done them wrong, I may be sorry for the impact that my words or my actions had, but I don't know that I would take responsibility for somebody's reaction. If that's a distinction that I've had to work a lot with recently, as
Yeah.
people have taken great offense by what I have said. And while I'm sorry that they take offense, I'm not sure that the offense, I think it's telling me more about the state of our polarization than it is actually about what I in fact said. If that makes sense.
It does. It's a much more gracious way than I've found myself responding when I've been in similar situations, basically by saying, "That sounds like a you problem." You know?
Well, that's one way of saying it. But and I had a teacher, a rabbi actually, who said to me, the things that people say about you or the things that they say about other people tell you more about them than it does about other people.
Mm,
Like and I think that there's some truth to that. It may not be universally true, but um, which isn't to say I take lightly the impact I have on other people. That's a whole other
mm.
category of self-awareness, and particularly for leaders it's really important. Power differentials and all of that, you just have to be careful. But yeah, that wasn't the case
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
president.
Yeah. So I wanted to also get into. I've been really basting in your writing and some of your past sermons. One that really hit a chord with me was your Easter Vigil sermon from last year, almost a year ago now. And the theme of it was,
Mm.
oh boy, moving toward light when it's still dark. So in that sermon last Easter, I think you were speaking of what's required on a personal level, but also what's required of us as a community or even as a nation. You've spoken openly about your seasons of depression. Just as I've shared on this program, and I'll share it with you now about my struggles with mental illness. So first of all, thank you. That really does mean a lot. It's not that it gives folks permission, but it's almost like when our leaders or folks that we admire and respect have a sense of invincibility, it makes our own frailties harder to reckon with, right? So moving toward the light when it's still dark is sometimes just the work of, in my case, getting out of bed during those seasons of depression, right? I was hoping that you could speak to that. What we can do individually to move toward the light, as well as what you think we can do as a community.
Mm. Well, the Easter story and the the reenactment, sacramentally and religiously in Holy Week is of moving from suffering through the horrors of suffering and death to the promise of resurrection. And there is this, so you walk with Jesus in the last days of his life, and his death. And then after the commemoration of his crucifixion on Friday, there is a period of silence and waiting and really nothing happening, um, until Saturday night. Usually, sometimes as late as midnight, sometimes some people do it early Sunday morning, but there is this beginning of the celebration of Easter in darkness with one candle, the Easter Paschal candle. And it is a reminder that the stirrings of life often begin, almost always begin, very small, imperceptible even in its stirrings. Um, and and if you're in this place of darkness, and I don't mean darkness as evil, but just where you can't see, right? You're just in a place where you're not able to see your way forward. So it could be grief, it could be trauma, it could be depression, mental illness, whatever defines that for you. Could be a time of war, talking societally, it can be a deep conflict. This stirring of new possibility begins so small that it would be easy to ignore it or discount it. And the invitation is to pay attention to it and to walk, as you said, walk toward it or move toward it. I often think of the women who, before dawn, went to the tomb, right, to take care for Jesus' body. How did they got up in the middle of the night and they started walking toward the tomb? Now they had no idea what they were going to find, but they were walking toward it. And that was my image of them. It's just that sense of like you're walking toward it. But as you walk toward it, it takes on more space and it's almost like there's a consent that you're consenting to it entering into you. And it causes initially some tension because by that time, at least in some instances, while it might be painful, but at least darkness at that point is familiar. And to be raised from the dead, actually, whatever death experience we're having, requires something of us, right? It requires our consent to live again, which means it requires our consent to have our hearts broken again. It means, agreeing to take on all of life again. And so a part of us may hesitate, and yet the invitation grows stronger as we move toward it. And our walking toward it or moving toward it also helps bring it into being. Like our participation in it is part of God's design. I'm not sure why. That was God's decision, but we seem to be an essential player in the resurrection story. There are witnesses. There are ways that we are asked to embody this new life, and so whatever that is, if it's learning to love again after your heart's been broken, or becoming a member of your family again after you've been away from it, if it could be learning to forgive, and to forgive and forgive and truly not necessarily let go of the pain, but not allow your life to be defined by that pain in such a way that you can't know joy again. Now, those are really big asks of a human being, and even more so of a society that's coming back from, from whatever definition or incarnation of darkness that collectively we might be experiencing.
Yeah, no, I've experienced that too. Folks who've lost loved ones that are close to them are hesitant to love that way again, that intensely again. Or even, a couple of years ago, we lost our family dog, Sugar Magnolia, Maggie May. And a couple of our, folks in our family were like, well, we're never going to get a dog again. I'm like, no, we must, because you just don't want to have your heart broke again. Now, this might seem like a very loose connection, but bear with me. But I, when this incident arose the day after Inauguration Day, and then all of the fervor and fallout thereafter, I didn't put two and two together until, because I try not to pay attention to the nonsense, but then I realized very quickly one of the things that to me over the last 5-10 years that did make a very big impact for me as a Christian was that day that he was still then president in his first term. Trump cleared out a peaceful protest in Lafayette Square with the force of the military behind him, only to hold up an upside down Bible in front of a church that he's never been inside for a photo op. And then this, I thought of it as this pastor, this brave pastor, spoke out. It was actually you. That's when I put two and two together. And you had that fallout when you spoke out against this betrayal
Mm-hmm.
of our deeply held, dearly held symbols as a means of a photo op, just after doing something that was so counter to the words of Jesus, right? And
Mm-hmm.
yet here you are, not even 4 years later, not even 5 years later, and you're diving right back into the fray. Does that occur to you? Did it give you pause as you were sculpting this homily? Did you know you had an even keener sense, I would imagine, of what you were getting yourself into?
Well, we had the leader of the cathedral. I I'm the bishop, so I could travel around to like 86 different churches, including the cathedral. And the cathedral has its own priest. His name is Randy Hollerith, and he and I and others spent a lot of time in the mid part of 2024 trying to determine what we were going to do about the prayer service after the inauguration, regardless of who won the election, because the country was so polarized that it felt like the service could feel like a spiritual or a religious endorsement of an election that 50% or more of the country would be unhappy about, right? So it just was this, like, what do we do about that? And the dean, Randy, the dean, made the decision that we would have a service that would be for healing for the nation, that it would be the same service regardless of who won. And we announced that beforehand. And he said, and the Bishop of Washington will preach. Now, if the newly elected president chooses not to be a part of the service, that's fine. We're going to have the service anyway. And so so I knew that I was preaching no matter what. And when it was Donald Trump who was reelected, I didn't, if he remembered me or if he even knew anything about the church, what we've been about as a cathedral, I wasn't sure that he'd want to be there. So I was really surprised actually when the inaugural committee was just wonderful. They were really wonderful to work with. They were very gracious and accommodating. They didn't ask in advance to see my sermon, which I thought they might. And others in other situations have, not me personally, but in other contexts, none of that happened. And so I didn't know what to expect. And yes, I did craft my words as carefully as I could. I wasn't trying to be offensive. And in fact, I spent most of the time crafting the whole part about what does it mean to pray for unity at a time when we have been acting as a nation, and certainly in the political process, in ways that work against unity so consistently. Like, how do we pray for something that we have no intention? I mean, as a minister, I have some real issues with praying for things that we don't have any intention of
Yeah.
following through on ourselves, right? We can't ask God to do if we aren't willing to do for ourselves what we can do, we can't ask God to do them for us, right?
Right.
God is never pleased with that. And so I was thinking a lot about that. And then I was thinking about all the people who were being left out of the vision of the country that the president had articulated, particularly the day before in his inaugural address. And that was, so yeah, I wasn't, I didn't know what to expect, obviously. And if someone says to me, did you expect the response that you got? I couldn't have expected it. I did the best I could with what I felt I was on my heart to say.
Yeah. Now, I've posted about you and have been in conversation about this occurrence. Um, and boy, first of all, I didn't know how fragile some of my friends were at the mention of, certain people and certain events. But that's another story. But one of the I received a lot of pushback from friends I used to go to church with. Like I said, it was not a church planted by John MacArthur, but it's in his valley and very much in that spirit. A lot of the pastors and elders are part of Masters University.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the objections are tertiary at best, and I don't really engage with. You feel free to engage. For example, just the fact that you're a woman in a senior leadership position. That's one that I feel like the churches and denominations have been having these arguments for a couple thousand years. So we can hash that out. But there is a pastor who I consider a good friend, Pastor Mike. And as it turns out, Mike and my dad have become very dear friends. My dad is an Orthodox Jew. Mike is a conservative, politically conservative, theologically. And by the way, Mike is like 6'10" or something, and my dad's barely 5'6" on a good day when the wind's blowing right. So they're just like this frickin' frack, but a wonderful, wonderful friendship they have. Mike pointed out, he said his objection was that at the very end, I said, well, I don't see what's so controversial about asking for mercy. That ultimately, that was an extension of your homily, of your sermon. And I tracked with the points of unity. I think there were three big themes that you were tracking with. And then the extension of that being a plea for mercy. I didn't see what was so wrong about that. What Mike's concern was that by naming certain people that deserved mercy, others others were left out. How would you, if Mike's listening right now, he deserves a hat tip because I thought it was a very thoughtful objection and question. How might you respond to that?
I think it's a very fair critique, right? And one that merits real thought. I can tell him that the reason I chose to focus on immigrants and the LGBTQ community is because in the build-up to the election itself and in the president's inaugural speech, he cast those two particular populations he spoke of them in such a broad stroke and with a singular swipe of negativity, that you had the impression that all migrants were rapists, murderers, criminals coming into this country to do us harm, and that women athletes were somehow at risk because of the sort of the demonic force of transgender athlete. I mean, there was just this sense of like this whole, and I think in that way, I wanted to bring the humanity of people that I knew felt completely discounted, right? And seen in the worst possible light and were afraid, right? But I could have easily added, people who are struggling from opioid addiction. I could easily have added people who are living in extreme poverty, right? But I was deliberate and particular of those two groups of people because of how they have been portrayed in singular form as threats to our country. And that was, so that was a deliberate choice on my part. But I can understand Pastor Mike's concern. And it was, and that is a point well taken. I accept that criticism, and there surely could have been ways I could have done it differently. Others have said, I think another legitimate critique, by the way, is that I addressed the president directly, and that I did not say to all of us gathered, we all need to be merciful. And I think that's a fair critique as well, singling him out in that way. But there I was following a tradition that is not, again, it's very, very, it's a real, like, for example, if I am presiding at a wedding, I'm speaking to everyone, but there's a moment in the service where I speak to the couple. And if I'm presiding at a funeral, I'm speaking to everyone, but there's a moment when I say something directly to the family. And in that instance, I wanted to appeal to the president. I made a point of appealing to his power. The fact that millions of people had put their trust in him, that he had been elected and to the highest position in the land, that he felt that God had spared his life, a providential, loving God had spared his life for this moment. So I was trying to say, you can be, you have, you can afford to be merciful. You can afford to be kind. Arguably, even carry out the policies he feels are right, but do it in such a way that people's humanity is not in any way put in question. And um, so that was my effort. That was why it felt more like a pastoral sermon than a prophetic one. I didn't mean to be. It felt like I was trying to. I was trying to speak to his humanity and bring the humanity of others into our consciousness. Um, Most immigrants are not criminals. Many of them pay taxes. They are working hard in the jobs that keep our economy going when in ways that, it's just hard slogging work and often at all hours of the day and night. So to cast them off all as criminals is it's not true.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, it's not true. And I also wanted to point out that, that issues of gender identification, that's not a Democrat thing. That's not there are, it's not a red state, blue state thing. Kids come out in all families, right? That's not something. And if there were 1,000 people in that cathedral, I'm guessing there were, just do the math, right?
Right.
So if not, if there weren't, gay and lesbian people in the congregation, they were family members who were. And so just to say, hey, let's remember that these are human beings we're talking about. Even if you want to change the policies, let's
Yeah.
remember that these are human beings. Yeah.
Now, in the follow-up, this is partly asking for advice and partly goes to the theme of our program. I know that you were on the receiving end of some pretty severe criticism, to say the least, as well as some pretty brutal attacks. How do you deal with that? I understand that you have some structures in place to help shield you from some of the worst of it.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that you have to build up muscles, like emotional, mental, spiritual muscles to deal with that. How do you do that?
Oh, well, not easily and not well all the time. It's not, I won't lie. It's not a nice experience to be on the receiving end of um, I mean, it's one thing to have people disagree with you. It's another thing for people to wish you harm, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's another thing to have your, um, everything about your being cast into outer darkness because of, a sentence or two in a sermon. So there is a kind of, uh, it gives you pause, right? It just gives you pause. And so, as you said, not only for my own ability to just keep about doing my job, we needed to put some boundaries around. And also, by the way, I should say, um, enormous outpouring of gratitude and support. I mean, just enormous. And so we have yet to open all the letters that have come to our office. 30,000 or more emails that, just so that the scale of the response, both positive and less than positive, shall we say, has been such that just managing that takes a system, as you said. Um, but the rest of it is internal, just kind of taking stock, um, how to distance myself from how people perceive me, and also how to just remain steady, right? Not to take the praise too seriously, and not to take the vitriol as, I mean, seriously isn't the right word, but personal. I don't know how to say it,
Yeah.
but just to let it be, let people be angry. I mean, I think, let people are entitled to their anger. People are entitled to their opinions about me. They're not entitled to hurt me, I'm going to protect myself, but they're entitled to their experience. And I'm not going to respond in kind, but I'm also not going to allow myself or my family or anyone be harmed in any way if I can stop it. So it's the balance, I guess.
Yeah. I guess that's a practice as well. I've noticed, I started meditating, not as a spiritual
Mm,
practice, but as a sort of to help my mental health. And
yeah,
one of the things that I do in meditation is what's called noting. And thoughts enter in, and you just, okay, there's a thought.
there
You
it is.
acknowledge the thought, and then you let it pass, and just get back to
Moving
your
on,
breathing.
right?
Yeah.
Yep,
So
yep.
it's interesting. It is indeed a practice. You said something a couple weeks later in an address to St. George's titled "A Friend in the Storm." You said,
Mm,
I dare say that many of us are carrying a big weight of uncertainty on our hearts. Now, I've been talking a lot about you, and now I'm curious about your parishioners. You said, I dare say that many of us are carrying a big weight of uncertainty on our hearts now for ourselves and those we love. So, how are your parishioners feeling? What kinds of uncertainties are they handling with?
well, I serve congregations in Washington, D.C., and the counties that surround Washington, D.C., so a very high percentage of people who are in the federal workforce. And so the the number of people who have lost their jobs in the last 2 weeks, or who have or are in danger of losing their jobs, or who have had new restrictions put upon them, or whose are watching entire departments just be slashed, having policies change overnight. So there is a degree of grief and shock. People were expecting it on some level, but it's one thing to expect the change and then to live through it, right? A number of people who are certainly we have the immigrant population, which I've mentioned to you, so that's a concern. We have because of our positions, our as I mentioned to you earlier before we started the interview, because of the fact that the Episcopal Church has been a welcoming church for gay and lesbian people for decades now, we have I would say, a disproportionate number of people who found a spiritual home here. And so just realizing that things that they once felt were secure civil rights are wondering if they in fact are in greater danger now. So the people are worried, and certainly worried for their livelihoods, their families, the direction of the country. We have a number of people who work in the State Department, a number of people who work in USAID. These are the Department of Education, Homeland Security, the military. All of these organizations right now um, are experiencing a kind of uh, dramatic turn. And so, no, not everyone. I mean, there are people in our congregations who supported the president, voted for the president, think this is a good idea. So I'm not saying it's a universal thing at all. We have our own diversity of experience and opinion. But I was speaking at St. George's. I was speaking to a congregation that I would say, you know, of the congregation there, I would say more than half were were fearing for their own livelihood.
Mm,
Because it's just that it's the major economy of the. I mean, it's not that much different. Like if a major industry, like when the auto industry crashed in Detroit and the whole
right.
city was affected. It's like that for Washington D.C. with the federal government. You know that if you start slashing the federal government at the extremes that seem to be happening now, it's going to have a ripple effect reverberate through the entire community.
So
And
it
that's what
sounds like you do have a fair amount of folks in your diocese who are supportive of Trump. I'm wondering,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, are you in dialogue with folks that are more openly supportive of Trump in any of your churches? And how are
No,
these conversations going?
well, I think it's that the people who are really angry with me aren't necessarily having conversations with me.
Okay.
But there are people who, I mean, of course, I mean, we have lots of differences of opinion. And um, so we try to find the areas where so like the people who would say to me, Bishop, we think we love you. We think you're a great bishop, but God, we wish you hadn't said that. You should, this really makes it hard for me. The cathedral may be no longer perceived as a safe convening space because people in the Republican Party feel like you're now a liberal, anti-Trump, woke, whatever the so I mean, they're
Yeah.
genuine conversations, and I listen, right? And I try to explain myself, and and I've been bishop for 13 years, so they know me pretty well. But I've never assumed that because I'm the bishop that first of all, that I'm right all the time, or that I'm telling people how to think for them. They think for themselves. But I'd be doing them an injustice if I didn't tell them from time to time what I thought, not as a dictating of all truth, but this is how I see it in light of our scriptures, in light of the tradition of our faith, in light of who I believe Jesus is to us and the kind of people he's calling us to be.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I I push back on the notion that politics shouldn't enter into our conversations in the church or even from the pulpit. Would I find myself object because after all, I mean, Jesus was political. He was, it had his teaching had economic ramifications. It was just in the center of all that stuff, right? Religious, obviously. And he was challenging every pillar of our
Hmm.
society, of who we are, right? And so I haven't tried to eschew the political ramifications from what we're earnestly
Hmm.
reading in scripture, earnestly encountering in scripture, right? But early on as a Christian, I noticed that a bunch of my friends did it the other way around. That they started with their political preferences and prejudices, frankly, and then backed shards of scripture into it, to the proof texting and what have you, in order
Hmm.
to support a leaning that was already there before they derived, right? So I guess my question is, how do we know that we're not doing the same thing?
Right. Oh,
Like
yeah.
how do we know that whether it's on LGBTQ issues, on immigration issues, on any number of these issues that become so politically charged, how do we know that we're not starting with our own preferences and leanings and then trying to back scripture into it?
Well, we might be. I think we have to be open to that possibility. We are not immune from that. Um, and not just in politics, by the way, but just how we see the world, right? And then we we read scripture according to the lenses of our lives, right? So that's one of the reasons why being in Christian community is so important, and why being among people who see the world differently is important, because we need the corrective lenses of a broader conversation than our own particular impulses, biases, and prejudices. We all have them, right? We all have them. And so it's a discipline to pay attention to the voices who disagree. And I think in some ways we are at a disadvantage when we are monolithic in our views as a congregation, say. If we have no one who sees the world differently, it tends to reinforce a particular worldview. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is how disciplined are we in the actual study of scripture, and how often, I mean, maybe here's a question to ask any of us. When was the last time you changed your mind? Like, when was the last time somebody actually, through an argument or a point of view, or typically it's an experience, right? It's a relational experience that changes our minds, right? To say, um, I I may not like believe one thing and then completely flip over and believe another thing, but I may see the world in a more nuanced, broader way by virtue of being in conversation with people who see things differently. And so I feel that that's part of why the spiritual experience is meant to be communal, for that reason. And also just self-awareness, right? If I hear myself, oh, I don't know, sounding a bit too shrill or too insistent or too, if you can tell that, I'm way more invested in this than is necessary, it's like, yeah, well, you might just want to check out like where that's coming from, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, um, but then again, just to say things from but also like life experience that teaches us things, right? Like, so I heard someone say that one person took issue with my focus on migrants now because as an immigrant, I was downplaying the hard work of people who have come into this country legally and how they have had to push and how they waited and the patience and all of that. And then just to give free access to people who just came over the border, that really hurts them. And I can understand that. That's a legitimate life experience that would tend to lead you in one direction or another. Um, it doesn't persuade me that we are to not offer hospitality to those who are coming in now, but I understand that impulse, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's
Somewhere Monty Guzman is smiling. Monica Guzman, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called I Never Thought of It That Way.
right, exactly. And also, even if we disagree, that doesn't mean that you are the devil incarnate. It just means that we see things differently, right?
Yeah.
And we can honor one another's dignity and respect each other's dignity, inherent dignity as a child of God and as another human being on this planet. And agree, okay, on that we disagree, but maybe there are other areas in life where we can find common ground. Or, I'm not going to ask you who you voted for if you need someone to, you know, help you in a way that I can help you with, right? I mean, why would I do that? Because there are probably more things that we have in common than the one or two things where we disagree.
I
At
think
least I hope that's true.
we can all have in common that the New York Mets is the best baseball team ever, and it's God's team. Absolutely certain about that.
Well, there you go. So, like, once we're clear about that, we can move on, right?
We're good to go. Toward
Yeah.
the end of your book, How We Learn to Be Brave, you said, I think a lot about how to speak of the challenges of our time with honesty, but not despair, with a sober assessment of the problems we face, and still with genuine hope for our future as a nation and a species. How do we do that?
Mm. Well, that is a practice. That requires an orientation toward life. And I think it's a grace. I think it comes. Um, I think it mostly in terms of generationally. I'm in my 60s now, and I don't want to ask my children and grandchildren to carry the weight of my despair, right? Because they need hope. And so I am going to live in such a way, even if I cannot change the things that are legitimate causes for despair. To the best of my ability, I am not going to live in such a way where I give up working toward the things that are worth striving for. And I'm not going to ask them to carry, in addition to the weights of their own life experiences, the cynicism and the despair that I might be prone to if I were left to my own devices. So I feel like it's a responsibility that I have as an elder to live in hope. not as a Pollyanna kind of thing. I mean, I think a sober assessment is needed, but that to whatever degree we can work toward the good, that we do that. And we have ultimate faith in God as good, and that there isn't anything that is beyond the redemption of a loving God. And that's a faith statement, right? I mean, you could argue it, and people might say that, it doesn't, it's not going to help us. We're still going down this path of self-destruction. And maybe that's true, but I'll live my life on the side of hope to the best of my ability. If not
Yeah.
for my own sake, then for those coming after me.
Yeah. Amen. So I have a couple more questions, and then we can wrap it up. And one is related to what we've been talking about, touching upon. It's called our TP&R question. That is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across these differences that we're talking about? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, even people who might not root for the New York Mets, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Well, it takes effort to place ourselves in circumstances of 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 real differences, because we have so separated ourselves in this society. And so I would say the first effort is to be somewhat intentional about seeking out those places where we're bound to be in relationship with people who see the world differently.
Mm,
And that can be in church, it can be in civic society, it can be in volunteering. Any number of ways we can um, seek out the experiences. It can be, watching the news program that you detest because of its point of view, right? Whatever it is, right? Just finding a way to be genuinely curious. Not only what a person believes or thinks, but how it is they came to that belief or thought. How is it that you came to that position? And trying to understand that. I mean, again, whether we agree or disagree isn't that really the point, but can I see your humanity? And and so that's one way. I would say, um, and then to resist, to whatever degree possible, to resist the kind of cheap, gratuitous singing to the choir or preaching to the choir kind of statements that um, are bound to. And I take this, like, for example, like, satire and comedy. Like, what are some of the jokes that you might find funny and you really laugh at them, right? It's something that I listen to myself. Like, what are the jokes that I find funny? And then I ask myself, at whose expense is that
mm.
joke being told? At whose expense? And just as a check, like, is that, do I want to engage in that, or do I want to try to fill my mind with other things, right? So I don't know. What do you have any thoughts on that? You've been doing this podcast for a while.
Oh, so you brought up an interesting point, and I'm going to have to think a lot more about this comedy and what we find funny.
Yeah,
There's this great documentary called "When Jews Were Funny," and I think there's something to it, and that is when you get people who are thoughtful and literate, and there's a tradition of really the people of the book, people of Torah. So you have to learn how to read and think and debate. But we've also been through generation after generation after generation of suffering. You get suffering
right.
and literacy, and that is comedy, baby. So, so it makes for really good comedy. Um, Gosh, is that so? I was going to give you an opportunity to turn the tables and ask me a question. Is that your question? How do we do it?
That's one. Yeah, one of. And well, I'm curious about how you started this podcast and why you started it, and what kinds of insights or experiences that you've had as you've done it that opens up your own mind that way. Yeah, how are you doing it?
So let me answer the first question first, but only partially. I mean, I've been doing this show for, over 4 years, and we're still having the conversation. And I've been having a similar conversation with my father for almost 25 years, if not longer. And we're still having the conversation. Thank God.
Mhm.
So I would say I mentioned Monica Guzman, who's part of Braver Angels, and her
Mhm.
book is really, and the organization that she has, which is about radical curiosity, as well as one of my favorite books, David Brooks wrote, came out about a year and a half ago, called how to know how to
how to
know a
know a
person.
person.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's just that. It's being able to have conversations where we're leaning into curiosity and we're leaning into seeing each other's humanity. So as opposed to getting into these contentious conversations where I'm listening only to be able to formulate a comeback to score some sort of imaginary point,
Right. Right.
I'm listening for that person's humanity and I'm asking questions to bring out their story of who they are as a person, right?
Right.
Or Monica Guzman's disposition of being in a conversation that allows for the possibility that I'll arrive at the place where I say, "Oh, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it that way." You know?
Mhm.
So those are a couple that come to mind. John Roush is a great evangel. I'm going to call John an evangelist, even though he's an atheist. He's a great evangelist for Braver Angels and exactly these sorts of conversations and asking exactly these sorts of conversations. For example, he was just on a podcast with Dr. Russell Moore, and I
Mhm.
just love hearing those conversations. Two individuals who couldn't be more different, that are able to have these rich, deeply human conversations that gives me such I'm so encouraged by those conversations. It is. And the reason I started it, I've alluded to it already in this conversation. When I became a Christian, my dad, about a month after, wrote this 10-page single-spaced letter telling me all the reasons why I mustn't, I could become a Christian. And it was from a historical perspective, a filial perspective, an emotional perspective, a theological perspective, every angle. And at first it cut right to my heart, that what I did in believing in the messiahship of this Yeshua ben Yosef was basically cutting off something I didn't even realize was so important to me at the time, which was the approval of my father, right? But what it was the beginning of a conversation of these deeply human experiences that we shared. And I'd be lying if I didn't admit that those first at least 3-4 years were very contentious. And I approached it from a very different way. I was a student of apologetics, so I was looking for how to more skillfully argue these points. But eventually it just became conversations over a cigar and some whiskey around a fire and talking to my dad about big ideas, how we live among each other better, whether it's religious, political, or otherwise. And we're still having those conversations. So when I learned about this medium, the very first podcast I listened to, I think it was a Mark Maron podcast where he did this long 2-hour interview with somebody like Sean Penn or somebody like that. I said, "Oh man, this is great. This is a great medium to have exactly these kinds of conversations," because I thought more so than any particular issue, if we didn't have a way to talk to each other or about each other when there were differences, when we were talking about people who had different beliefs than we do, we're not going to be able to tackle any of these issues. So let's start having these conversations about how to do it. So that's a little,
Wow.
yeah. But anyway, that's a little bit of the background of this. But I have a feeling we'll still be having these conversations because it's not like we're solving the problem, or as you describe it, maybe we are, but it's more you wake up and decide to get out of bed, and that's all you can do. And when you talk to someone, it's not like you're going to convince them to make an 180-degree turn, but maybe have a little bit of seasoning in how they think of things and how they see the world,
And their impact on you they're having that same impact on you, right?
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
willing to be changed.
Yeah, except when it has to do with the Mets. There's
Yeah, what's up with the Mets?
Anyway, yeah, it was something that came up very early on. My mother's first reaction when she heard I became a Christian, she calls out to my dad. She says, "Du hast," this Yiddish. She goes, "Du hast, the son's a born again Republican." And I'm, "Mom, where did you get that from? I don't understand." And my dad said, "So what is this? A Yankee fan now?" You're a Yankee? I'm like, "No, Dad, come
Uh,
on. There's only so many lines I could cross at once."
there you go.
So we did cover a lot, but is there anything important we haven't discussed you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
No, No, I think this has been wonderful. Really grateful for the conversation, Corey.
I'm so grateful that you gave us the time. I hope it's not the last time. I'm going to be in DC, so I'm going to be sure to visit one of your churches when I'm
Okay, let
there
me know.
in the spring.
Let me know when you're coming.
Absolutely. So before we go, how can folks follow you, find more information about the Episcopal Diocese of Washington and all the great
Yeah,
work that you're doing?
I will re-enter social media in a week or two. I've taken a bit of a respite, but people can find me there. And the diocese has a website, www.edow, the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, edow.org, and they can find everything there, my writings, my comings and goings, and the work that we do as a church.
Great. And we'll be sure to
So,
put that in the show notes,
okay.
edow.org. Thanks so much for
Yeah,
doing this. It was really great. It's such a treat to
lovely
be
to
able
talk.
to talk to you, directly after reading so much of your stuff and listening to some of your homilies. And this is really a treat for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write the review, and watch the conversations on YouTube. Support us on Patreon, all that good stuff. It really does make a difference. So thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.